Welcome to the next lesson in our survey of Genesis. This is lesson 20, and it's entitled Tangled Webs, as you will see. We're going to start off by looking at the context for this lesson. We're in chapter 38 of Genesis, if you want to turn there in your Bible. But we're thinking about Jacob's life and where he is in his life's journey. And last time we were talking about Joseph being sold into slavery by his brothers, so about 108 years into Jacob's life. And this story is going to take place, we presume, between the time that Joseph is sold into slavery and Jacob reunites with Joseph in Egypt. And so you've got a span here of 22 years or so where chapter 38 is going to unfold. So a lot of elapsed time happens within the story that we're going to look at. The other thing that is really interesting about this particular lesson from 38 is its positioning within the story of Genesis. So not only is it a story that's going to take place over many years, it's interesting that it happens right after we learn of Joseph being sold in slavery, but before we really find out much about what happens to Joseph in Egypt. And I think that the Spirit's actually very intentional about where this particular chapter falls in the story of Genesis. And I'll tell you that this is a really difficult story. Chapter 38 is a challenging chapter. A lot of times if you're going through a survey of Genesis, you might find somebody conveniently sort of hopping over this story, but I think that would be a big mistake. If you were to pluck this chapter out of the Bible and look at it on a standalone basis, it would be a story that has very little redeeming quality other than the fact that it's all about redemption. So we're going to step into it, and before we get to Genesis chapter 38, we're going to start in Matthew chapter 1. Because the interesting thing about this story, and we've talked about this before, is that Jesus Christ is going to be born into a family that as part of the genealogy, as part of his lineage, as we know, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are part of that lineage. And the older brothers, starting with Reuben and Simeon and Levi, are not in Jesus' lineage, but Judah, Leah's third child, is in Jesus' lineage. And so Matthew lays this out for us in his version of the genealogy. And one of the things that's really interesting is that if you read through here and all of the different people who are showing up, most of them are going to be men. Most of them are going to be the father of somebody who's the father of somebody who's the father of somebody, all the way down to Jesus. But in the account, there actually are 5 different women that are mentioned in the genealogy. The first is the wife of Uriah, or Bathsheba, who is the mother of Solomon. So David and Bathsheba, Solomon is their son. She's not mentioned by name, but we know who she is. And then there are 4 other women in the genealogy that are mentioned specifically by name. The first is obviously Mary, who is Jesus' mother. But then we go back and start seeing women who show up before David and Bathsheba, starting with Rahab. So Rahab was the prostitute in Jericho that ultimately becomes in the lineage of Jesus by marrying Salmon and having Boaz. And then the other woman that's going to be in the genealogy is Ruth, who ends up marrying Boaz. And then the 4th woman who's in the genealogy by name is a woman named Tamar. And Genesis chapter 38 is all about Tamar. We're going to learn about her. But here she is enshrined into this genealogy. And at the end of the lesson, we're going to come back and maybe think about why these 4 women, 5 if you include Bathsheba, are mentioned in the genealogy, and specifically the part that Tamar has to play. So we're going to talk about the royal tribe, Judah. He's starting a tribe that's going to end up being the royal tribe. It's going to produce David and then all the kings after David and ultimately Jesus Christ. And it talks about Judah, presumably after the time when he and his brothers sold Joseph into slavery, that he decides to break with them, and at least for a time, he leaves them. And he goes to visit a friend. Don't know if it's an old friend, a new acquaintance, but it's a friend. He's a Canaanite, so he's not a believer. And so we're going to start this story off with Judah and his friends in low places, visiting this guy named Hirah. And there he saw a woman that caught his fancy. Her name is Shua, is the daughter of Shua, so we don't know her name. They never tell us her name, but her father's name is Shua. And so he decides to take her as his wife. And from that marriage, 3 different sons are produced. So he has his first son called and a second son called Onan, and a third son called Shelah. And it says Judah was in Chezib when she bore him. So presumably this entire time, Judah is separated from his family. He's living in this Canaanite area, kind of northeast of Beersheba and Bethlehem area. So he's spending all of his time, once again, in association with people who are not probably helping him to stay true to what he should believe in. So the rural tribe's off to a start, but it turns out that it's a rocky start. So some time clearly passes, quite some time, because we're going to skip all the way forward to when Judah is ready to find a wife for his firstborn son. So we're going to be talking about, 15 to 20 years, probably, something in that neighborhood that's going to elapse. So quite a bit of time. Judah's going to go to find a wife for his firstborn, and her name is Tamar. We don't know much about Tamar's background, so we're going to assume she's a Canaanite based on where Judah's living. Don't have any other information, but he finds Tamar and puts the two of them together, arranges their marriage. And then there's this interesting tidbit that this guy, is not a good guy. In fact, he's very wicked, so wicked, in fact, that the Lord takes his wife. And once again, remember that whenever you see the Lord particularly capitalized, we're talking about Yahweh, his personal name. So this is personal. It says Yahweh put him to death. Yahweh took his life. And so Judah said to the younger brother, Onan, you have a duty to perform here. Your older brother died without having a son, and so there's no heir, and your obligation, your duty is to actually provide an heir for Tamar. Remember, this is before the law of Moses is given, so it's several hundred years, probably at least 600 years before the law of Moses is given, and yet that same obligation that we're going to find in Deuteronomy is still here. So whether it's a practice or a tradition, or whether it's an expectation that's been passed down by Yahweh himself, Judah says to the younger brother, you have this obligation, you need to do that. And so Onan agrees to do that, but then he pretends to fulfill his obligation and doesn't actually do that. And so the Lord considers him wicked and takes his life as well. So Judah's first 2 sons have now died by the hand of God, which would be a sobering thing for a father and a mother, and for a widowed, now twice widowed. And so Judah's thinking about what to do next, and clearly if he thought that the second son was obligated, then the third son would be obligated too. But presumably the son is too young to perform that obligation. So he says to Tamar, look, my youngest son is too young to be married at this point, so you need to go back to your dad's house and hang out there, and as soon as he's of age, then he'll be your husband and provide you an heir. So he makes that agreement and sends her back to her father's house. And so it says that Tamar went and remained in her father's house until Shelah was old enough to be her husband. So this tradition is later actually encoded into the law. So you can go to Deuteronomy chapter 25 and you can see where it spells out this expectation that if a man doesn't have an heir and dies, and he has a brother, or not even necessarily a direct brother, but a kinsman, then that person becomes what's called a kinsman redeemer, and has an obligation to give her an heir. And if he refuses to do that, which is his right, then the woman has the right to shame him publicly. And that's what this whole passage says. You can read it for yourself, Deuteronomy 25, 5 through 10. But this expectation that Judah has ultimately ends up being encoded in law. And you might be thinking of another instance where this pops up, and we're going to talk about that in just a moment. Well, time goes by, and Judah's wife, unnamed, Shua's daughter, passes away. And when Judah's finished with his grieving, he goes up to hang out with his friends in low places to where the sheep shearers are, and he takes his friend Hirah, the Adullamite, and Tamar hears about this. And Tamar knows enough time has passed that Shelah should be ready to fulfill his obligation. And so she concocts this scheme and goes down by the wayside. And frequently, the wayside between towns would be where either cult prostitutes or just regular prostitutes would hang out. And so she basically pretends to be a prostitute. And I think this says something about her understanding of her father-in-law's character, that her expectation is that if a good-looking woman, presumably a prostitute, Judah comes by, there's a chance for interaction. And so that seems to be what she has in mind, and it works like a charm. So she takes off her clothing that clearly shows that she's an unmarried widow. She puts on clothing that for the Canaanites would have indicated that she might be a prostitute, including covering her face so she can't be recognized. And Judah comes along and says, hey, I'd really be interested in getting to know you better. And so she says, well, we're not going to do that unless you've got money. And Judah says, I don't have money, but I can give you a pledge. What I'll do is give you a young goat in exchange for getting to know you better. And so she says, that sounds good, but I need security. So she's shrewd and she's smart. She's not going to just take the promise of a young goat without some sort of security. And so he says, well, what do I have that would work? And she says, I'll take your signet, which is generally a ring that somebody would wear that they use to press a seal into wax if they're going to send a scroll. For other purposes that indicate that this is an official document and it's been signed by them, and rather than a signature, they use the signet to provide that. And it generally had a cord that it was attached to, so presumably that's what the signet and the cord are referring to. And then she asked for his staff, which is a significant ask. All these are significant asks. And once again, it's sort of reminiscent of Esau, who's willing to give away his birthright for some stew, that Judah's willing to get to know Tamar better in exchange for some things that are very valuable to him and that's going to be difficult to conduct business without, including just walking up the road with his staff. But that's the agreement that they provide. And so afterwards, Judah goes on his way, and Tamar goes back to her father's house and resumes her life as an unmarried widow. So Judah, interestingly, goes back and says, I've got to get the young goat back down to this woman and get my stuff back. I don't know that Judah would have been in a rush to get the goat back to the prostitute otherwise, but in this case, he understands that he's got some significant collateral that he needs to collect. So he sends a friend, his friend, the Adullamite, Hirah, to go back and give the goat to the woman, which he tries to do and finds out that no one knows who he's talking about. He talks about where this happened, where Judah met the woman. They said, we don't know of any cult prostitutes that's there. We don't know any woman that fits that description, so we can't help you. We don't know who you're talking about. And so Hirah has to go back to Judah and say, I'm sorry, man, I couldn't find the woman. And so that's the end of the story as far as Judah's concerned. He's like, well, we can't really go do a big search because everybody's going to laugh at me. If I tell the story about what happened, that I traded my signet ring and my cord and my staff as collateral for this exchange, then they're going to think I'm a fool. And they would be right. That's a foolish thing for him to do. It turns out to be really foolish because about 3 months later, it turns out that Tamar's pregnant. And so this comes to knowledge. People realize that Tamar's pregnant. She's an unmarried widow. She's been living a lifestyle of an unmarried widow. And so clearly something's been going on that is not public knowledge, but now it is. Now it's very obvious. And so Judah was told. The news gets to Judah, and it says, Tamar, your daughter-in-law, has been immoral. Moreover, she's pregnant because of her immorality. Now, this is an interesting moment for Judah, right? So Judah's response is, she sinned and she needs to be punished. And it's interesting to think about his motive, right? Is Judah so offended by Tamar's activity and what it means for their family, what it means for his first son and his second son, who were killed by God himself? Is he so offended that he says what he says, which is bring her out for capital punishment, bring her out to be burned? Or is this just a really convenient way for Judah to take care of a problem that's been brewing in his family, to get his youngest son off the hook, to get this Tamar woman out of his life? And also, is this a really convenient way for him to bury the knowledge of his exchange, his relationship with Tamar? So, who knows? It doesn't seem like he's put two and two together necessarily about Tamar being the woman by the side of the road. So I think it's probably more of that second reason. But that's his response. He says she needs to come out and receive the punishment. Once again, punishment for adultery in the law of Moses is a capital punishment crime, can be. And this is before the law of Moses, but even at this time, Judah says, look, if you're caught in adultery, whether or not in the act or whether the repercussions, then that's a capital crime. So Tamar sends word to Judah, her father-in-law, in response to the charge, and says, just so you know, by the man whom these belong, and she sends the signet ring and the cord and the staff, these belong to the man who got me pregnant. And she said, please identify whose these are, the signet and the cord and the staff. And you'd like to be there to see Judah's face when the messenger brings the message and the stuff. And Judah says, well, that's my signet ring and my cord and my staff. And the signet ring is something that you really couldn't deny. It had a seal, some sort of visual image that was clearly Judah's. Maybe a cord and staff you could pass off, signet ring, nope. And so here's Judah's response. Judah identified them, and she said, she is more righteous than I, since I did not give her to my son Shelah. And then it says he did not know her again. In other words, they didn't have a married relationship, right? They didn't continue to have a relationship, intimate relationship. But the response is fascinating to me, right? That Judah didn't say, Tamar's more righteous than me because of my choice to lead her into immorality, not because of my choice to potentially respond to the accusation by wanting her to get taken out of the way. Basically, he's saying, she's just a little better than me, which is an interesting take. And it's also fascinating to think about what would Jesus do in this situation. And we don't have to think about that very much because we actually have a real scriptural example of what Jesus might do in this exact situation, which we're going to look at in just a moment. Well, if we want to ask ourselves the question, what would Jesus do? We can actually just go to John chapter 8 and have an answer to that question. You see, in this situation, Jesus finds himself having to be tested when people bring a prostitute to him who they say has been caught in the act of adultery. And they test Jesus by asking him what should be the response under the law of Moses in such a situation. And obviously the law in both Deuteronomy and Leviticus, Deuteronomy 22, if you want to read it. If a man is found lying with the wife of another man, both of them shall die. The man who lay with the woman and the woman. So you shall purge the evil from Israel. And then Leviticus 20, verse 10, if a man commits adultery with the wife of his neighbor, both the adulterer and the adulteress shall be surely put to death. So that's clear. The Pharisees know. Jesus knows. But there's an interesting missing element from this story, just like there is in the first, right? You have a woman caught either in the act of adultery or in the implications or ramifications of adultery. And there's a missing element in both of these stories, which is the man, right? So the Pharisees didn't bring a man and a woman to Jesus to be judged, even though they were caught in the act. So presumably they could have, and yet they just bring the woman in a very similar way to the story of Tamar. And the motive that they had for bringing the woman to Jesus, I think in a similar way to Judah's motive for asking Tamar to be brought out, is not righteousness, according to the law, not to follow the directions of the law and therefore be righteous under the law, but in this case to simply trick Jesus, or in Judah's case, to get rid of a problem very conveniently. So in this case, the men bringing the woman to Jesus are the actual ones being tested, and Judah is actually the one being tested, and they fail. And of course, Jesus responds in a very clever way to put the onus back on them by saying, you're right, of course, whichever one of you is sinless, go ahead, get the party started, pick up the first stone. In a similar way as Judah is forced to confront his own sinfulness and realize that he's in no position whatsoever to punish Tamar. And so the lesson is pretty clear. We'll talk about it at the end. Righteousness is much more complicated than just following what the law says, especially when your motives are not righteous motives, but selfish motives, as in the case of both of these stories. So, Tamar is not put to death. Judah says, I don't know what he says to her. I don't know whether he says, welcome to the family. We're going to take care of you while you're pregnant. I don't know. All I know is that they're not husband and wife. They're not in an intimate relationship. But this pregnancy is going to come to fruition. In fact, when it's time for the baby to come, it turns out that there's two. There's twins. And so she's in labor. One baby puts out a hand, and the handmaid ties the scarlet thread on his hand so she can keep the babies separate. And then that hand disappears, and then another baby shows up, the other twin, without the scarlet thread. And so once again, you've got a sort of Jacob-Esau kind of phenomenon happening here, where the second, by all rights should have been the second-born son, ends up being the firstborn son. So the firstborn son's name is Perez. The second son's name is Zerah. So you've got Tamar, who is daughter-in-law to Judah, but also had two sons by Judah. You've got Shelah, who is both an uncle and a brother to Perez and Zerah. So that's about as tangled a web as you're going to find. Sounds like a really interesting family dynamic. We don't really hear a lot more about any of it. So we don't know how Perez and Zerah were brought up. We don't know if they were brought up as sons of Judah, brothers to Shelah, or whether they were kind of outcasts. We just don't know. We do know that this whole situation has an interesting parallel. And we can look to Ruth to see that parallel, and we're going to look at that really quickly just because it's fascinating. The same idea that there's an obligation for a brother to take care of his sister-in-law when the brother's passed away is what's known as a levirate vow. And that's going to come up in Ruth chapter 4 when Ruth has come to Boaz and identified him as her kinsman redeemer because Naomi has told her that Boaz is a kinsman redeemer. And Boaz realizes that he's not first in line as kinsman redeemer. He loves Ruth. He's come to appreciate her beauty and her spirit and her character. And so he wants to be her kinsman redeemer and marry her and provide an heir to Naomi's husband. And so Elimelech. So he's going to go to the elders and follow the procedure that we saw in Deuteronomy, where he's going to say, I'm here as a kinsman redeemer, but I also know there's somebody that's ahead of me in line. So he does this. He goes to the elders of the city and he says, Naomi's come back and she has a parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. And so I thought I would tell you of it and say that to the person who's first in line, you have the opportunity, if you want, to be the kinsman redeemer and buy the land and provide continuity for Naomi's family. And he says, oh, that sounds like a great idea. And then Boaz says, oh, by the way, there's a woman named Ruth that comes along with the bargain. Ruth is Naomi's daughter-in-law. And that was too much for that particular individual. It explains the whole issue that the custom in former times involved taking off a sandal and using the sandal as a way to seal the bargain, which is interesting if you look back at Deuteronomy and the levirate vow, the sandal's involved there too. So if the man says, I'm not going to do what I'm obligated to do, the woman has the right to take his sandal, spit on him, and shame him in public. In this particular case, the sandal is used to seal the vow. Well, as you know, Boaz not only becomes kinsman redeemer, marries Ruth. They have a son whose name is Obed. And Naomi's family line continues. And Obed is the father of Jesse, who's the father of King David. So you've got two very different stories concerning this same exact subject. One with evil men who are unrighteous and unresponsive to the law, to the expectation. Then you have a righteous man, Boaz, who is the kind of kinsman redeemer that God must have had in mind when he had his spirit write that law in the first place. And the fascinating thing is Tamar and Ruth, both two women in the genealogy. Very similar situations, very different outcomes. Once again, the question at the first part of the lesson was, what kind of family would bring a Messiah into the world? And the reality is the kind of family that has challenges and dysfunction and problems with righteousness and unrighteousness and makes bad decisions. So we're going to find out as we finish this study of Genesis that ultimately Jacob and his sons and their families are going to end up reunited with Joseph. And that's a fascinating story and a much more fun story to tell. But ultimately, Jacob's going to take his whole family down to Egypt and be reunited with Jacob. And we're going to find out that Judah travels down to Egypt, and along with him, Shelah is going to accompany, so his third-born son, who he would presume to be his heir, and along with them, Perez and Zerah are going to be there as well. Well, it turns out that Perez, whether he's the heir or not, Perez is going to be the one who is in the line that produces David the king and Jesus the Messiah. So I wish we really knew a lot more about the family dynamic and how Perez grew up and how Judah treated him and how Judah treated Tamar. We just don't. We do know that something happens to Judah between all of this and the time that he's going to be confronted by Joseph. That when Judah actually is forced to choose whether he's going to be deceitful and foolish and do the wrong thing in front of Joseph, who doesn't know is Joseph, he's going to make the right choice. So something happens to Judah between the time of this story in chapter 38 and where we're going to see him standing before Joseph, being accountable for what Benjamin has presumably done. And we're going to see a little bit of a different Joseph. And ultimately, the reason that we spend time in chapter 38 is because, first off, once again, we're reminded that God will work his plan through us, with us, or despite us. And he works his plan to bring the Messiah into the world despite the choices that Judah makes, despite the choices that his first two sons make. And he brings Jesus into the world through the woman Tamar and Perez, her son, by an illegitimate relationship. And then you see all of these other characters in the genealogy, including Rahab the prostitute, Ruth the Moabite, Bathsheba. I don't know Bathsheba's background. Uriah is a Hittite. I don't know if she is or not. But at any rate, you've got a really interesting family that Jesus comes from. Once again, we can learn from the successes and failures of those that precede us. Chapter 38 is a lot more about failure. In fact, I really can't identify much success in chapter 38. If we were looking at truths from Genesis 38, we could probably come up with a lot of things you shouldn't do, like visit prostitutes and trade away things that are valuable for things that are sinful. I figure those are self-evident, so I'll let you ponder those. Probably the biggest reason we would look at 38 is because we see once again that God's promise to redeem us, even when we make really bad choices, is still there. And I think we see that in Judah's life, that he's still the one that started the royal tribe. He's still the one that is the king maker, David, the son of Judah, Jesus, the son of Judah. And we even see at least a hint in Judah's life that redemption happens within his life, despite all of the really bad choices that he makes. Ultimately, God will redeem us from our bad decisions if we just trust him, if we trust in his son, Jesus Christ. And maybe the most important lesson from this is that Jesus came from a dysfunctional family, and don't we all? If we come from a dysfunctional family and we can be saved, if we come from a dysfunctional family and God is willing to save us, it gives us comfort to know that as dysfunctional as it could possibly be, in chapter 38 is probably the height of family dysfunction. God is still able to redeem in those really difficult situations, which makes me feel so at peace. Because I'm a dysfunctional person from a dysfunctional family, as are all of us, and yet God still loves me and sent his son for me, and I'll have a place with him forever because of Jesus Christ. Next week, we're going to jump in and start talking about Joseph. It's really Joseph through the end of Genesis. So read 39 and 40, and we're going to start tracking with Joseph's roller coaster ride as he is welcomed into the land of Egypt.